Today, if you would turn to John chapter 6, we'll find in verse 14 that the people said, "This is truly the prophet who was to come into the world." That ties us directly with the end of chapter 5, in which the Jews in Jerusalem and the religious leadership refused Jesus' claims and the evidence he presented, which was the testimony of a prophet named John, which was the works he did, which was the Father's own voice, and the Scriptures. And he said that since they wouldn't accept that, he would not need to condemn them, but Moses would rise up and condemn them. Well, these people, if we find out in the wilderness of John 6, are readily acknowledging the truth that the religious authorities at the temple and in Jerusalem steadfastly refused to see. So our prior stop on the tour of faith had been Jerusalem, in the shadow of the temple, where the man was healed on the Sabbath and told to take up his pallet and walk. And then in the temple, as Jesus argued with the leading religious authorities of the nation. Now we find ourselves in John 6, some months later, in a deserted place up on the north side of the Sea of Galilee, which John tells us also has the name of Tiberias. So John 6, we'll read verse 1 through 15 on this next stop, and a totally different response as John takes us on this guided tour of faith. John 6:1. After these things, Jesus went away to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, or Tiberias. A large crowd followed him because they saw the signs which he was performing on those who were sick. Then Jesus went up onto the mountain, and there he sat down with his disciples. Now the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was near. Therefore Jesus, lifting up his eyes and seeing that a large crowd was coming to him, said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread so that these may eat?" This he was saying to test him, for he himself knew what he was intending to do. Philip answered him, 200 denarii worth of bread is not sufficient for them, for everyone to receive a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There's a lad here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are they for all this many people?" Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." Now there was much grass in the place, so the men sat down, in number about 5,000. Jesus took the loaves, and having given thanks, he distributed to those who were seated. Likewise all the fish, as much as they wanted. When they were filled, he said to his disciples, "Gather up the leftover fragments, so that nothing will be lost." So they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with fragments from the 5 barley loaves, which were left over by those who had eaten. Therefore, when the people saw the signs which he had performed, they said, "This is truly the prophet who's come into the world." So Jesus, perceiving that they were intending to come and take him by force to make him king, withdrew again to the mountain by himself, alone. Between that discussion in John 5, where Jesus called the witnesses and said Moses would rise against them, and here on the other side of the Sea of Galilee, they are acknowledging that very truth and saying, "We should make you our king. Let's do that right now, folks." A great number of things had happened. From the other Gospels, we find out about the apostles plucking grain on the Sabbath and a man with a withered hand, so there were some Sabbath controversies. Jesus had finalized his picking of the 12, and he gave the Sermon on the Mount. He healed the centurion's servant, and he raised the widow of Nain's son. He gave all the parables of Matthew 13. His family came to get him, thinking that something bad was happening with him. The 12 were sent out on a limited commission, and they had just recently returned. And finally, they had heard of the death of John the Baptist. So it was an appropriate time that they go and take a bit of a break. It says this in Mark 6. The apostles gathered with Jesus. They reported to him all the things that they had done. And he said, "Come away by yourselves to a secluded place for a little rest." Well, secluded till the crowds got there. For there were many people coming and going, it says, and they did not even have time to eat. So they went away in a boat to a secluded place by themselves. The people saw them going, and many recognized them, and they ran together on foot from all the cities, and they got there ahead of him. Don't you hate it when the crowd beats you to the secluded place? When Jesus went ashore, he saw a large crowd, and he felt compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. Well, we could read this also from Matthew 14 and Luke 9, again, as well as Mark and John 6, both. This is one of the few occasions where we have records in all four Gospels. Other than the resurrection, this is the only miracle recorded in all four Gospels. So for those of us who like to harmonize and sync up the Gospels and construct a timeline, although I think we have to say that syncing up and harmonizing all this is a very modern pursuit as opposed to an ancient one. It wasn't too much a gospel time concern, but this is one of the places we can do that because we know in all four Gospels we're here in exactly the same place. Well, we will stick mostly to John. We won't hop back and forth trying to get every detail harmonized, but we'll take it mostly as John tells here to tell it. And so we're going to have the feeding, and then we're going to have the limited perception based on what Jesus was doing. Of the feeding now, we're going to talk about this large crowd that followed. We'll talk about the impossible situation that presented regarding food, and yet we'll see they got all that they wanted. So, we start with a large crowd following. Again, John 6, verse 1, Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. The large crowd followed because they saw he was performing these signs among the sick. They were not disappointed in the least. Jesus both taught and healed them. It says in Matthew 14 that they followed on foot. He felt compassion for them, and he healed their sick. And in Luke 9, it says he welcomed them, speaking to them things of the kingdom of God, and curing all those who needed healing. So here was Jesus in great need of a rest. Here was Jesus with his apostles after such a period of great activity, saying, let's come and rest. And when he gets to the place of rest, he finds people in need of his help and people in need of his compassion. And so we find basically here the same rule that Jesus follows on every Sabbath, which is you can do necessary and compassionate work, right? Necessary and compassionate work were reason enough to be active on the Sabbath, the day when everybody was supposed to rest. Well, on this day, I don't know what day it was. I don't know if it was a Sabbath or not. But Jesus had intended it for a day of rest and a day or two of recharging after such activity and after such grief of hearing of the death of John. But that is suspended because of the news. And we think about how many times do we intend to do a thing that's beneficial to us, a helpful thing to us, a refreshing thing to us. And yet because of necessary and compassionate work, we had to put it off. And so here's Jesus in the same situation. One other point here. It says the Passover, the Feast of the Jews, was near. This gives us, if we are correct about the time of Jesus' death in 33 AD, this gives us a Passover, 30 AD, gives us a Passover just before that, as this event taking place. That Passover, which John refers, is the one we believe took place on April the 16th of the year 29. And so right about April the 1st, maybe it was a few days still of March by our calendar, maybe it was a few days into April, but right around April the 1st of our calendar in the year 29 is when these events took place. Again, modern fascination with we like to date things, don't we? We like to have a time stamp. We're lucky and fortunate that John gives us the 4 mentions of Sabbaths, or 4 mentions of Passovers, so that we can date the ministry of Jesus. Well, with that large crowd following, and we know the number 5,000. With 5,000 men out there, and one of the Gospels says that doesn't include the women and children that came with them, this presents an impossible situation. They had followed Jesus. Jesus got in the boat, and Jesus and the disciples had sailed across. And you think about how much provision can you put in a boat? Well, certainly enough for several days alone, right? So we're like packing up the car to go camping for the weekend. There's no limit nearly to the amount you could take with you for a several days trip. But these crowds, they're not getting in a boat that they prepared to go on a prepared trip. These crowds have followed Jesus on the spur of the moment. They recognized the boat was leaving, said, let's go. And I'm sure as they went through villages, then more people were wondering, where are y'all going? Well, Jesus is going to this place. And I'm like, well, let's go too. And so it's a bit of an impromptu crowd. Now, impromptu hiking for day trips or overnight trips, that's usually something that requires at least a little preparation, right? You don't do it totally with the clothes on your back. Come on, folks, let's go for a 10-mile walk now. And Doug would say, I have on the wrong shoes, right? And John would say, I don't have my canteen. And James would say, I bought some land, and I have to go look at it. No, sorry, that's a different story. But people would say, hold on, we're not prepared. But if Jesus was there, you go if you're prepared or not. And it appears that's what they did. They went prepared or not. And so this large crowd was out there. And when it was time for dinner to come along, we've got 5,000 men. Matthew specifically says it's 5,000 men, besides the women and children. We've got people out here with their families. We've got maybe 6,000 to 8,000 people, has always been my best guess. We've got 6,000 to 8,000 people out there, and it's getting on time to eat. We think about what would an army do if they had 8,000 people in the field? Well, they got mobile canteens, right? Fire up those big diesel trucks and drive those portable kitchens out there and start making. Or I recall at a camp setting where I was at, where they would feed people, there was about 400 of us at camp, and they would feed us 3 meals a day. And I was there 2 weeks in a row, and I saw at least 3 times the Cisco semi out there loading out supplies from the semi truck into the kitchen, because we had 400 souls that wanted to eat 3 times a day. And I'm thankful for that, because I was one of the 400. So just think about the logistics of feeding this many. And even if you could get to a nearby village, buy up everything that they had and bring it back, Philip brings up the obvious problem. That's 200 days' wages. That's most of a year's salary. Just take your pick as to what number you want to put on most of a year's salary. But if you had to feed 6,000 to 8,000 people, what would it cost? And so the thing we learn is that what we cannot do, God can do. Now, Philip said, well, we got a little. He said, we have in verse 8, a lad here, one boy who was prepared enough that he brought a good lunch. He brought 5 barley loaves, and he brought 2 fish. And we think about this boy, and we think about the goodness of his preparation. Also, the fact that people know what he has means that he's opened it up and said, well, I'll share with somebody, right? Because how would you know what people had in their packs? And so this prepared and apparently generous young lad says, I'll do what I can to help. And Philip brings that to the Lord's attention, and he says, Lord, we have but very limited resources. And I got to tell you, for us to bring up the fact that we have limited resources to the Lord in prayer and in in honest conversation with the Lord, I don't think that's a bad thing at all. To admit that we have but limited resources to deal with the problem. Of course, the problem came in with the last of it, was with the suggestion. But what are these for so many people? Suggesting what the Lord might or might not do with them, maybe that's not the best idea. Lord, I don't know what we can do. I only got this. Well, Lord, I've only got this. That's, again, no problem. But Lord, I don't think we can do anything with it. Well, with the Lord, what can the Lord do with just about anything? So if you think about this by parallel, it's a different situation. It's a different kind of problem. But this is what the Apostle Paul learned as he suffered greatly for the cause of Christ. 2 Corinthians 1, verse 8, he said, "We were burdened excessively beyond our strength, so that we even despaired of life. Indeed, we had the sentence of death within ourselves, so that we would not trust in ourselves, but in God, who raises the dead." Well, he didn't need to raise them from the dead because he didn't let them get killed, but they are in danger of death. "Who delivered us from so great a peril, and will deliver us. He on whom we've set our hope, he will yet deliver us." Well, in this case, they learned not to trust in themselves. And they learned the Lord would help and provide again, just as he always had. But that lesson from Paul's situation, or of the fish and the loaves here, we learn not to trust in ourselves. We learn to trust in the provision of God. And so when the Lord got to doing with that little bit, they went from having a great lack to having a great abundance. Jesus said, "Have the people sit down," verse 10. Now there's much grass in the place. We figure everybody's stretching out, people sitting down and being able to relax, waiting on the Lord's provision. So the men sit down, and the number was about 5,000. We're told in another gospel they sat in groups of 50. Probably made it easier to have that way. You could walk amongst the groups, but also, if you have 100 groups of 50, what do you got? You got 5,000. So you got 100 groups of 50. What if you were tasked with just feeding one group of 50? Well, and so, Jesus then took the loaves, and having given thanks, he distributed to those who were seated. Likewise, also the fish. And here's the key: as much as they wanted. They had all they wanted. They fully got to eat as much as they wanted. This is the goodness of God. They got to have all the bread, and they got to have all the fish. And so I picture Jesus standing there with whatever bag, canvas bag, or whatever basket this was brought in, because we find there's a number of baskets present. Jesus standing over the bag or standing over the basket, and he brings out a loaf. And he brings out a loaf. And he brings out a loaf. And he brings out a fish. And he brings out a fish. A loaf and a fish. A loaf and a fish. Even just that. I think, but between 6,000 or 8,000 servings of that, wouldn't you be wore out? You ever been at the head of a serving line? Here you go. Here you go. Yeah. Even when it's all there and all you got to do is just put it on the tray. Just imagine doing that 6,000, 8,000 times. Just about, even if you had a shovel, if you could shovel the fish and the bread for 6,000 to 8,000. I picture Jesus at the end of this, fully exhausted, while everybody else is sitting rested and satisfied. And the apostles running around making the deliveries of what the Lord provides. And in so many ways, I think that is a picture that helps us, it should help us, in things of gospel ministry, in things of other earthly ministries and services. Those that we're serving, they get the benefit. Because who are we serving for? For them, right? This is the compassion of Jesus. The compassion of Jesus was to feed, to heal, to teach, and to feed. And so in giving so much, they sat there and received that which the Lord gave. And the Lord's servants are the ones who take from the Lord and his blessing and distribute it. Those who are doing the serving, should they say, I'm getting tired of walking. Man, that 100th group, because, again, we got 500 groups of 50 on the ground. Walking after that 100th group. But how appreciative are they? They're appreciative, aren't they? Now, there might have been a few malcontents. Hey, how come we're the 100th? Well, you just were. We'll get to you in good time. And hopefully nobody spoiled it with that kind of attitude. But Jesus gave them all they wanted. We have this phrase from Romans 10 and verse 12. He is the Lord of all, abounding in riches for all who call upon him. Abounding in riches for all who call upon him. Or the famous words from Exodus 34, stated by God himself as he passed by Moses. Then the Lord passed in front of Moses and he proclaimed, Jehovah, Jehovah, God, compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in loving kindness and truth. This statement, compassionate and gracious, abounding in loving kindness. This was quoted again in the Psalm 103. It's in the prophets, it's in Joel 2. It's quoted by Ezra in the book of Nehemiah. But this statement of who God says he himself is, Jehovah God, compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in loving kindness. And he certainly was to them that day. And so when they all had all they wanted, when there was fullness of eating, when satiation had been reached, everybody who wanted to eat had as much to eat as they wanted. Jesus said, go pick up the leftovers. Verse 12, when they were filled, he said to his disciples, gather up the leftover fragments so that nothing will be lost. Nothing will be lost. I think here again we see the nature of God. What does he want that he provides to be lost? He's given so much for us. I don't think he wants any of us to be lost. And I think he cares more for us here than the bread. But the bread and the fish are picked up. And I find it interesting they picked up 12 baskets. They gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with fragments from the 5 barley loaves, which were left over by those that were eaten. You start with 5 loaves, you end up with 12 baskets of leftovers after 6,000 to 8,000 have eaten. Now, how many apostles are there? There's 12. How many baskets are there? There's 12. And so when this is finished, picture this. Out there on the grass, 6,000 to 8,000 people have eaten their fill. 12 apostles coming back up to Jesus. Each apostle has his own basket full of leftovers. And who do they come to? To Jesus, the compassionate provider. And here he is. I imagine him again. After a day of teaching, a day of healing, a day when he had gone out there to rest and he gets no rest, and then he served out all this food. I imagine, just picture him exhausted, sitting on the side of the hill there. But he has given of himself to provide for everyone, right? And isn't that the picture of the gospel? He giving of himself to provide for everyone, the apostles being the messengers or conduits of that goodness to the world, and then us, the people, out there on the grass, having our full, having our fill because of his goodness. Well, as this went on, the people then recognized there is something great about Jesus. They recognized the same truth as we mentioned that those in Jerusalem had refused. Their leaders down in the capital and in the temple, they had refused this realization. But the people on the grassy hillside up in northern Galilee by the sea, they realized it. Verse 14, therefore, when the people saw the sign he'd performed, they said, this is truly the prophet who's come into the world. Deuteronomy 18 had said, this is the words of Moses, I will raise up a prophet from among their countrymen like you. Words to Moses by God. I will put my words in his mouth, and he will speak to them all that I command him. And it shall come about that whoever will not listen to my words, which he shall speak in my name, I will require it of him. Last week we pointed out, Jesus said, because you won't recognize this, Moses is the one who will reject you because he spoke of me in those words. Back in chapter 5, don't think I will accuse you before the Father. The one who accuses you is Moses, in whom you set your hope. For if you believe Moses, you'd believe me, for he wrote of me. But if you do not believe his writings, how will you believe my words? And so we said about this that they honored Moses and his law and all the profession with their lips, but they didn't really listen and learn. And so Moses will condemn them as being deaf, dumb, and blind to the reality of Scripture. These people got, up in this crowd, what the leaders didn't at all get. The leaders had unbelief. These believe. But, and here's our closing for the day, they were going to misuse that belief. Though they believed in Jesus, what Jesus was going to do and how they thought that was going to work out, they were as off base nearly as their leaders were. They were going to misuse the truth as badly as the unbelievers. Verse 15 as we close. So Jesus, perceiving that they were intending to come and take him by force to make him king, withdrew again to the mountain by himself, alone. They had worked out, what could this man do in front of and in charge of a literal army? What could he do against the Romans? Imagine if you had an army led by him. You wouldn't need any supply chain. You wouldn't need any supply wagons. You wouldn't need any mobile canteens. You wouldn't need any mobile kitchens to feed the people. What would you do at mealtime? You just make the food. Would you need a doctor's corps or a nurse's corps? Would you need medics to follow along with the army? What if anybody got wounded? He can heal them. Would you need any engineers, any siege works? Would you need to drop complicated battle plans to attack defended camps and defended cities? Just march around it like it's the walls of Jericho. And down it comes. How could you lose if this man is the head of the army, if this man is the head of the kingdom? Of course, this plan of having the all-powerful one and all-knowing one in charge of your army only works if he's not opposed to it. Because if he can defeat all the plans of your enemy, what can he do to your plans? He can defeat those pretty easily too. And so this little plot to make Jesus the king by force, how long does it last? Long enough for Jesus to walk to the other side of the hill. Remember, there are several times in the Gospels where there are unbelieving crowds who want to harm Jesus. And they, at Nazareth, try to throw him off a cliff. In the temple, they pick up stones to stone him. And what does he do? He just passes through the crowd. And so these delusional believers don't have any more success in forcing things onto Jesus than do the unbelievers. He escapes the unbelievers just as easily as he avoids these delusional but friendly mobs that would pretend to be on his side. And so here is for us a last lesson from this incident. Just because we say we know who Jesus is, or we recognize that the power of Jesus doesn't make us right and true and good disciples of his at all. These people are as off base in many ways as the unbelievers. And so he just avoids them. He just avoids them. What does he do with the unbelievers until it's time for him to submit to their will and to die for us? He just avoids them with ease. What does he do with these delusional believers? He avoids them with equal ease. And so we can have folks who claim to follow Jesus and recognize truth about Jesus, but be just as off base in many ways as those that don't. And so the rest of chapter 6 is a striking chapter and a difficult chapter, because Jesus is going to separate the wheat from the chaff, not of the believers and the unbelievers, but of the ones who profess belief in him and the ones who are true disciples. He was not desperate to get followers of any sort at any cost. He wanted faithful disciples. He didn't want mob followers or food followers. He wanted those who truly were God followers through him. And the rest of chapter 6, we'll see the working of that out. So with that we close. They recognized the great truth that this is truly the prophet. And yet still, they messed it up so many ways. If we ever find ourselves in that situation where in belief in Jesus, we have wrong notions that would cause us to have bad action, that we would truly follow what he says, that we'd humble ourselves to receive his true instruction, realizing a partial understanding is not sufficient. Let's look next time as we study how we can avoid that trap.